Oh,
So,
I don't even have, no one even has to agree, huh?
yeah. Good afternoon, everybody. This is the Rising Tide. I'm standing in for Matt. He had a snow emergency, and hopefully will be back in the course of things here. But I agreed to set you or start you off. Okay. So today we have the very, 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 very great pleasure of having Nancy Spannaus with us, who is an absolute gem. I've known Nancy for many years, and uh, Nancy has written a number of books. Nancy is now the president of the American System now, and she is going to talk about unraveling the world historic achievement called the American Revolution. And she will have some very important insights and dynamics, which made 1776 possible. And especially, she's going to talk about Alexander Hamilton. I think she is the world expert on him. Okay. Yeah. So we're very happy to have you, Nancy, and please go ahead.
Okay. Well, I'm gonna switch it a little bit on you. I had the pleasure of speaking with you a number of months ago on the Declaration of Independence and what went into that, the causes of the revolution. Um, and this week, I'm going to discuss the follow-up to that, which is the creation of what happened after that and how revolutionary was it? Because this is a matter of, like most everything about the United States, is a matter of great contention, both within the United States and outside. Uh, I mean, I've heard people say, surprising people say, well, the revolution in the 18th century, which people really care about in the world, is the French Revolution, right? Not the American Revolution, which seemed totally crazy to me. But when you actually listen to what people are thinking about the American Revolution, uh, you can understand where some of them are coming from. So, okay, now I don't know that I prepared myself for my PowerPoint. But I should have been doing that. Uh, let's see. So that is our topic. And the quote that underlines this point, effectively, I think, is from Benjamin Rush, who was a Philadelphia founder, signed the Declaration, and was extremely active in the Revolution period. And he did and in the going into the Constitution, and he gave an address right before, I met this person, right before a few months before the Constitutional Convention, where he said the following: "There is nothing more common than to confound the terms of the Revolution with those of the war. The American War is over, but this is far from being the case with the American Revolution. On the contrary, nothing but the first act of the great drama is closed. It remains yet to be to establish and perfect our new forms of government and to prepare the principles, morals, and manners of our citizens for these forms of government after they are established and brought to perfection." So that's a provocative thought that was shared by John Adams. The revolution and the war are not the same thing. But many people don't think of the continuation of our government into the Constitution as continuing the revolution. Some of them think there are a lot of arguments against this revolutionary nature. Some say, well, it was just a conservative revolution after all, because they were out to save the rights of Englishmen, right? Some say it was just two different oligarchies, one over here, one over there. Some say with no evidence at all except an ideological desire that it was to save slavery. I'm not going to deal with that unless you want to in Q&A. And then the last is, uh, that the whole thing was, the Constitution made a mockery of the Declaration. And probably the most common is to think of it as actually a counter revolution. So the what we're going to do is describe that what the founders thought they were doing and what they actually did. The fact is that the founders believed that what they were doing was securing the rights that were won in the war and that were laid out in the Declaration. They saw that as creating a republic, but not a democracy. They actually called it they were extremely wary of a democracy. The French Revolution hadn't happened yet, so they weren't talking about mobocracy in the modern time. They were talking about it in the Roman times, when there were huge upheavals of the mob, mobilized by oligarchical factions, as you know, and they were extremely wary of unleashing. So their idea was a democratic republic with the population involved in choosing representatives to run the government, but no hereditary privileges, but a commitment to the general welfare on the part of the government and the rule of law, including natural law, not simply the positive laws that would be established. Now, if you look up the word republic, you will find an incredibly wide array of descriptions of what people think it is. I mean, some people say, well, it's a non-monarchy, right? Other people talk about it with other characteristics. But I've come up with, rule of the people, right? All very relatively unprincipled in my view. So I came up on the basis of my own reading of the philosophers involved in developing the idea of a republic, going back to Plato, to Cicero, to many great writers after that, in which I believe was a conception that was shared by many of our founding fathers. They had a concentration on the public good as the concern of the government, and that the citizenry had to link their own idea of their personal welfare as consonant with that public good and use their freedoms to ensure that outcome. So in other words, you have obligations as a citizen to cultivate the virtues and welfare not only of yourself, but of your fellow citizens. And that this is the key to happiness, both for the individual and the state. So let's see how, according to that idea of a republic, we actually stack up. So the first thing that happens after the Declaration, actually starts before the Declaration, is that the states become independent. Actually, there's a at the time of the Declaration, there were already two states that had set up their own new constitutions before the end of September of 1776. Three more had. The person who called for that to happen a little bit late was John Adams. He considered initially that this was the major revolutionary step, saying that all the states, the colonies, no more had an obligation to England, and they should set up their own government conducive to the happiness and safety of their constituents, and afterthought, America in general. So, as I said, New Hampshire and Carolina had already adopted new constitutions. The Virginia, Delaware, and Pennsylvania were not far behind. Now, this is the Pennsylvania grouping establishing their own new government. Now, these new state constitutions had some, strong Republican impulses. They made certain kind of changes that they saw moving in that direction. One was to expand the size and power of the legislature and diminish the power of the governor. They maintained a bicameral system. They generally reduced property qualifications for voting, expanding the electorate, but usually didn't eliminate them. They emphasized putting citizens' rights in writing. This was a problem with the British system, where you often didn't have that in writing. But they also were wary, many of them were wary of power per se, right? And so the terms were very short. The laws were often rapidly changed. This created some problems in terms of their operation, but which we'll get to. But some of the Republican principles that also came into effect, the disestablishment of an official church, which existed obviously in New England as well as Virginia and numerous other states, removal of feudal inheritance laws. That was one of the accomplishments in Virginia. A lot of these laws that are overthrown were more in effect in the southern states than they were in the northern, but nonetheless, this was the trend. Amelioration of criminal punishments, many fewer death penalty punishments in the Americas than in England, and that increased. Freedom of speech, and the banning of slavery began in some states, and restrictions on manumission in others. I mean, you may recall, I'm sure I mentioned it before, that in some states it was illegal. I mean, like in Virginia, it was illegal to manumit your slaves unless you got specific permission from the governor to do that. So all these freedoms, became customary and still are today, with the exception of the latter, which we know faced quite a struggle. Meanwhile, the leading statesmen were saying, well, it's not really enough that we have 13 great functioning republics here. We have to have a framework for collaboration between the states. We have to have national unity and ability to act together. And their solution was to establish the Articles of Confederation and Perpetual Union. That was written by John Dickinson and adopted in 1777. But not adopted by the Congress in 1777, but the states would not ratify it until 1781, which was the time that Virginia conceded that its claim for land all the way to California, which is what it had, it would give up to the Union some of its more extensive land claims. So in there was a push. Let me see if I've got that. Yeah. Well, I'm wondering if I missed something here. Yeah, here's the Confederation beginning to give you an idea of its character. So you've got the United States of America, right, which actually is there earlier in the Declaration. Each state retains its sovereignty and independence. That's A number one. And they enter a firm league of friendship. Then they have the common defense, security, mutual and general welfare. But it's a firm league of friendship, not anything more. So, with seeing this as inadequate, these far-seeing statesmen, like Alexander Hamilton, begin to say, "We've got to do something about this." He enters the fray in 1782. He writes a series of papers called the Continentalist Papers, which I'll tell you a little more about. He drafts a resolution for the New York State Legislature, which he's a member of, in 1781, I believe, calling for a national convention to revise the articles, but it passed, but it didn't go anywhere. And then when he was in Congress, which he was 1782 to 1783, he also drafted a call for a national convention, but this was abandoned due to lack of support. So he was thinking in this direction. Now, what was he thinking of? He outlines that in the Continentalist Papers. I think we're about 6 papers published in the newspapers of New York, but they got around. Primarily, he was looking at unity through control of resources, i.e., the economy, the ability to regulate trade. All of that could not be done by the articles under the Articles of Confederation unless every state agreed. You couldn't have a majority of 10 states, against 3. Every state had to agree, and they kept coming up with tariffs that could provide a little bit of revenue to the national government, and New York wouldn't agree, or Rhode Island wouldn't agree, or whatever. So and therefore the Articles of Confederation never got its own source of income. Never. It all just depended upon the states. So they had to ask the states for money. Actually, in one year, I think it was 83, Hamilton himself was appointed the tax collector for New York. He collected 0. Nobody wanted to donate money to the national government. So these were his proposals at the time. He changed them. Later on, he was against a land tax because it was too linked to speculation. No longer did they have the capitation tax either. But what happened here is, but he clearly had the idea not just of supporting the functioning of the government, but also giving the government the ability to shape and improve and develop the economy. And this, I think you can see by the fact in one of those Continentalist papers, he discusses Colbert as one of the, as indicating a model, in effect, for what could be done. Laying the basis for commerce, establishing the manufactures, when you didn't have the easy physical resources to do so. So this is something he is looking toward. In fact, I think very much Hamilton was comparing himself to those in Europe who had to break down local satrapies, and which of course is something that Colbert had to do. So he is proceeding with that, and but not getting anywhere really in the early 1780s. And the British are carrying out economic warfare, and which we'll also get into. But and then things get even more complicated with the signing of an agreement on the end of the war, because the treaty that was agreed to allowed the British to collect bona fide debts, loyalists to be free from prosecution just because they were against the revolution, and the demand that they either give back the Negroes or compensate those who had enslaved them. So this made it even more messy, because there was a tremendous amount of resistance to this idea, particularly that you had to pay your debts, if they were bona fide, that is. And there was also a tremendous amount of there had also been a good deal of land seized from the loyalists in the wake of the revolution, and that was not supposed to go through, according to the Treaty of Paris. So things were pretty agitated at this period, about 1783. And there were some significant problems that made it iffy whether the Confederation could hold this thing together, whether even the victories won in the revolution, in the war, not in the revolution, could actually survive. I just loved that section from the Hamilton musical, if any of you have seen it, where King George says, okay, you've got your independence, now what are you going to do? Because there was a great deal of dissension over what that should actually be. So what were these problems? Well, they had physical devastation. This is perhaps one of the most extreme. The British had pretty much wrecked New York, and then afterwards, as the war was breaking down, as the peace was moving to be implemented, you had the fire, which is a great deal of controversy over who actually set it, whether it was done by the Americans or by the British. But that's just an image that I'm able to get. There was lots of devastation in the farmlands, in the industrial areas that had been built up by the British and so forth. you had the debt, which these are the figures. You had the foreign debt, no interest having been paid. You had the domestic debt, no interest having been paid, and state debts, all of which pretty much meaning that you couldn't get credit. And the British had been the source of credit before. And this was the people who were owed money were not really in a very much of a mood to continue to lend. So in the states where in some states, there was crushing taxation to pay those war debts, which was causing instability. This being the famous Shays Rebellion, which began in August there. As I said before, you had British economic warfare. Not only had they physically destroyed things, but they were dumping goods in the post-war period to try to bankrupt industries that had been built up during the war. They were preventing, to the extent they could, the Americans from trading with their colonies elsewhere to restrict trade revenues and so forth. So there was considerable economic warfare. The British forts were still on U.S. territory, Detroit, the Niagara, all the way up here. So that was a physical danger, and they also were in position to deploy and cooperate with the Indians to attack the new nation. So there was interstate conflict, especially in harbors like New York. New York was in a key position because any international trade for Connecticut or New Jersey had to come basically through their area, their port areas they claimed as their port area. So they would try to tax them twice, right? So it got quite heated between the various colonies. There was not a great sense of cohesion as every state tried on its own to bring itself above water, depending on how much destruction and problems there were during the war. And basically, the Congress, which was convened under the Confederation Articles, was often reduced to a handful of people. They weren't interested in coming. They had no power. They had no revenue to do anything. They could only request, and it just it didn't seem worth it for people who were elected there to go spend their money to live in a different place and go and deliberate when they couldn't implement anything. So there were considerable problems that were only getting worse in the course of the 80s. So things those far-sighted people began to take action, and the primary motivation at the beginning was economic. It was what to do for development on the Potomac River to the west. As you probably know, George Washington's greatest dream was to be able to navigate the Potomac all the way out to its headlands. That's impossible. The Potomac very often is so low that it won't take significant boats for commerce. So it was necessary to build, and then there are waterfalls that are significant. So first thing had to be done was to build canals around those waterfalls. But there was difficulty because there had to be cooperation between Virginia, Maryland, and actually eventually Pennsylvania. So a series of meetings was held. Um, the In 1785, George became president of the Potomac Canal Company. Um, but he needed these agreements. So first he called a meeting with where only Virginia and Maryland were there, and then that seemed to be going okay, but they needed to be expanded. So James Madison said, well, let's have a bigger meeting. Let's call everybody together figure out how we can have economic cooperation. And that resulted in the famous Annapolis Convention, which brought only 5 states out of the 13 that they hoped to be there. But given the people who were there, which included Alexander Hamilton and James Madison, they took the bold step of calling a national convention. They just said, well, nobody's here, but everybody agrees that the Articles of Confederation are inadequate. So we think that there should be a convention to change those articles. They actually said, let's see, apparently it was New Jersey, interestingly enough, who made this proposal, or I find it hard to believe it wasn't Hamilton, but maybe they were just wanted to do something diplomatic for New Jersey. But this is what they call for extending the powers to other objects besides commerce. And they want that to be in a future convention. They think that the power of regulating trade is really a question that affects the entire national government. And therefore, to do that, may need to adjust other parts of the system. So we need a convention. And they actually set a date for the convention, which went ahead. All the states appointed delegates, except Rhode Island. Don't remember precisely why Rhode Island said they couldn't do it, but I think they were in the middle of a total conflict between the representatives of the city and the countryside over revenue, and they decided to take care of their own problem and forget about the national situation at the time. So going into the convention, what were the major issues? There were 55 delegates that were chosen, that showed up. Actually, more were chosen. At least 29 had fought in the War of Independence. I think that's significant. Only 3 were members of Congress at the time. And what were they fighting about? Well, one, will the representation be by states or by population? I.e., will we keep with the same system we had with the Articles or not? What kind of executive and who should choose it? It's a choice between, does the legislature choose the executive? Does the Senate choose the executive? What do you do? distribution of power, how much do the states have, how much do the federal government have, what's the future of slavery, and should there be a Bill of Rights? These are all are discussed at the Confederate, at the Constitutional Convention. But looking at it on a higher level is Alexander Hamilton, right? Saying, well, really, this is our first and last chance, right? And the major issue here is, are we going to have a union or not? And if we will be able, without being, under immediate attack, we don't need a commander-in-chief at the moment to mobilize forces, without, by our own choice, are we able to devise a government which achieves the safety and welfare of our population? So that's in Federalist number 1. I'm not going through everything in the Constitution, because what I'm really going to get to is the revolutionary elements that did end up in the Constitution, consonant with our initial revolution. So the final, in resolving all these issues, the delegates to the Constitutional Convention come up with 73 articles. We agree on this, 73 different things that we agree on. So that's a little unwieldy, they thought. I don't think they think today. I think you have many constitutions that go on and on and on and on, with 120 articles and so forth. But they viewed that was really not put together in the way that it should be. So they're always setting up committees. They're setting up committees, of arrangement. They're setting up committees of this and that. And at the last minute, having decided on this at the beginning of September, they set up a committee of style and arrangement. And they elect 5 members of the 5 delegates to be on that. And these are the guys: William Johnson, who is a delegate from Connecticut, and he's the chair. Of course, I basically never heard of him before, but apparently he was a very respected member. Alexander Hamilton. That's very interesting. These people were elected with no dissent, right? Gouverneur Morris, representing Pennsylvania, but being a New Yorker. James Madison, and Rufus King, who I think ultimately was a senator from New York, but he was from Massachusetts at the time. So these are the guys who are tasked to put this unwieldy set of statements that are agreed to into a constitution. And they do a tremendous job. Morris is generally attributed to be the writer of the preamble. Not sure that no one's absolutely sure that is true, because there are a lot of guys with strong opinions there, but Morris and Hamilton were very similar. But definitely Morris is looking at the Constitution as having a higher purpose than the particular laws and procedures that are outlined. And note the difference between it and the Confederation. We, the people of the United States. Originally, this said, we, the people of New York, New Jersey, Pennsylvania, South Carolina, North Carolina, etc. Changed to we, the people. It adds perfect union, justice, tranquility, and the blessings of liberty to our posterity, which are not in the other document. So you've got a real change of identity, in effect, where the Constitution is directing that there be this is a constitution of the electorate, of the people, and consonant with that, it determines that it will be ratified by the people. It won't be ratified by the state legislatures. It won't be ratified by the Congress. It will be ratified by special conventions, which the people elect. Now, one thing that's interesting that I just want to note is that in the course of outlining the powers of the Congress, they include the idea that they would be making their laws under the law of nations. So it is generally agreed that the law of nations was incorporated as a framework of law in the Constitution of the United States. Now, what is the law of nations? What I'm familiar with, and you probably are too, is the major book written by Emer Vattel in 1758, which was an extremely popular book of philosophical more than laws per se, about the necessary conduct of governments toward their population and governments toward nation states toward each other. But this actually ends up being very interesting because it establishes certain kinds of laws of war, certain kinds of respect that nations have to have for each other, and so forth, that were considered to be law under the Constitution as well as what is otherwise specified there. Now, when the Constitution is voted up by the delegates after the Committee of Style and Arrangement puts it all together, they send it to the Congress, and the Congress sends it to the states to set up this procedure. In doing that, at the time they do that, George Washington appends a letter, to the Constitution, urging its ratification. And this is a very interesting letter because it puts the weight of Washington, who of course was the chairman of the Constitutional Convention, said very little in the course of the operation, but clearly had the most weight with the population as a whole, as a political figure, given his role in shepherding us to victory in the Revolution. So here he is talking about the general agreement that it was necessary to have a different more powerful government, but that it wasn't, you didn't want to trust all these things to one body of men. And you had to have compromise between the states and the federal government, because if everybody had all the sovereignty they needed, they would be destructive to others, or could be. So he says, you may have to sacrifice to get along, to create this union, especially because these different states have different habits, different, and so forth. But we kept in mind that the greatest interest of every true American is the consolidation of our union, which is involved which is obviously messed up, but in our prosperity, felicity, safety, and perhaps our existence, which is a very important concern on their mind. So you should be not rigid on minor points. We had a spirit of amity, and you should too. Maybe everybody won't agree. As you may know, the stipulation was that 9 out of 13 states had to agree. But they had to include the big states, or else it was worthless. Each will consider your own circumstances, but the important thing is that it promote the lasting welfare of the country and secure her freedom and happiness. So that's an important element. It was printed all over the country and shared, and that's a significant element of the Republican nature of this government, in fact, because there was 9 months. September 17th, the Constitution is signed in Philadelphia. The declaration that 9 states had agreed comes in at the beginning of July, I think, of 1788. So you basically have 9 months of debate over ratification. The first Federalist paper is in October of 1787, but even prior to that. But it's not just the Federalist paper. There are attacks on the Constitution. There are, pamphlets going hither and yon, and then there are the ratification conferences themselves, and those we will talk about in a bit. So, what ends up being uniquely Republican about this process and what results? So first, you have the assertion of the we the people. It's a written constitution, and it's short and flexible. Basically, a lot of it is procedural to tell you how to address problems, not what the particular problems are. It's often wondered why the Constitution was able to survive so long, because I believe we're the longest surviving Constitution. Other places have had to change theirs. And this will give you an idea. This quote is from John Marshall, the Supreme Justice of the United States, in the Bank case of 1819. when Maryland was attempting to tax the Bank of the United States, and Marshall just led the court in unanimously deciding that they didn't have the right to, and that the Bank of the United States was a constitutional expression. It was allowed by the Constitution. So the argument on the other side was, well, the Constitution doesn't explicitly say that you can have a bank. So he said it doesn't need to have that. This kind of constitution, a constitution which tries to give an accurate detail of all the subdivisions into which its great powers will admit, would be like a legal code and could scarcely be embraced by the human mind. It would probably never be understood by the public. Its nature, therefore, requires that only its great outlines should be marked, its important objects designated, and the minor agreements composed these objects be deduced from the nature of the objects themselves. That this idea was entertained by the framers of the American Constitution is not only to be inferred by the nature, but from the language. In considering this question, then, we must never forget it's a constitution we're expounding, not a legal code. So that, people attribute this idea to, or connect this idea to the idea of a living constitution, that I think could be accurately done, one that could adapt to circumstances but maintains certain principles. So Republic is how much involvement there was in the ratification. Now, I added it up, and there were actually nearly 1,500 delegates elected in all the 13 states. Actually, 12 states, because Rhode Island didn't get around to this for years. So there were 1,500 delegates. The largest one was Massachusetts. That's the town meeting state, right? But Virginia had a lot. And on top of that, all that discussion in the media, which I mentioned before. The first half of the Federalist Papers were published as a book in the spring of 1788. So even though the Federalist Papers were written for newspapers in New York, they were definitely circulated throughout all the states. So there was enormous involvement on every level of the population in deciding on the Constitution. And you may recall, some of you, that when the ninth state agrees, the ninth state having been New Hampshire, I believe, there's a massive demonstration in New York City in celebration of meeting the requirement, which includes a major ship that's entitled the Alexander Hamilton. But this parade was not just the oligarchy, was not the financial powers, that creditors that wanted their money back. This was artisans, this was, shipbuilders, factory workers, mechanics, and so forth, all of which really were interested in getting a unified nation. They were celebrating. So 9 months of debate with a idea of creating a strict and indissoluble union, which is what the Federalists were insisting on. Now, There are other very specific elements in the Constitution which were unique at the time from a Republican standpoint. First, the no title of nobility shall be granted by the United States government and not by the states either. Pretty unusual at the time. Article 4, Section 4 guarantees a republican form of government, i.e., no dictators here. This is also unique. No property or religious qualifications for office. This was not necessarily true on the state level. States would possibly, ban Catholics or ban non-Christians or other, or as I said before, definitely have property qualifications. Up until maybe the end of the 1820s, there were almost all states. By the end of the 1820s, almost all states had eliminated property qualifications, but they continued throughout. But for the national government, for the Republican national government, no property or religious qualifications, just an age qualification, no religious test. The right to a jury trial, obviously something that was very dear to the heart of the revolutionaries in their struggle into the into the war. And then the powers of Congress being given the powers over the economy, which had been traditional in the British parliamentary system, but is laid out to a degree of great specificity in this particular Section 8. And this, I didn't, and most importantly here, making all laws which shall be necessary and proper for carrying these powers into effect. That was actually the element of the Constitution which Marshall was referring to when he said that they actually had in mind that it would be necessary to make other laws as circumstances arose in the later on. So then you get to the the second article is on the Senate's powers. I'm not going to go into that in particular right now. There's nothing particularly Republican on that. The presidential powers are relatively undefined, limited. Execute the laws, commander-in-chief, make treaties, but with agreement of the Senate. On slavery, no definitive decision was made by name, as you know. No, the word slavery does not appear. A date was set to ban the slave trade at 1808. And that was seen at the time as a way that's in the context of slavery being on its way to die. There was a specific vote in the Constitutional Convention against putting calling slaves property in the Constitution. It was defeated. There was also a move from the slavocracy delegates to have the enslaved counted as whole persons for representation in Congress, which is the basis on which Frederick Douglass says that, this is not, that the 3/5 clause in his view means that it would be a benefit for the states to free their slaves. If they did, they'd have more representation. So it was an anti-slavery move in his argument. And then asserting Congress's powers over the territory. But these obviously are value-laden decisions. They're not simply technical. The idea that to ban the slave trade was not an economic decision, much as it was based on the fact that from the very get-go of the Revolution, the slave trade was seen as a horrible abomination. But people in the South at that time said, yes, it was a horrible thing, but we need it to make our income. And besides, the British won't let us give it up. So, but at this time, that still was the attitude and what was intended. So and all these elements, were there before the Bill of Rights, which of course was having a vote on the Bill of Rights was actually a condition for Massachusetts, Virginia, and New York ratifying the Constitution. If there had not been a promise that it would be taken up by the Congress, a Bill of Rights would be taken up by the Congress, the opposition in those areas might have prevailed. But they did not, and Congress did do what was promised. They did take up the Bill of Rights. Once again, I think there were 23, I think, particular rights that were outlined, which were knocked down to 12, sent to the states, and 10 were approved. The last one that was approved was was just passed as a law in this century, I believe, which was that Congress can't raise its own salary in the course of in its own term. That was one of the original ones. So, and then I just decided at the end a cap off to thinking about this whole issue. Oh, wow. The winds have just begun here. We're supposed to have up to 60-mile-an-hour winds coming through my little town. So if you hear a crack in the window, that's the problem. Anyway, I think that I'm not going to read it, certainly not read it here, but it's very much worthwhile in thinking about this.
Nancy, did we lose you?
I think she got hit by those 60-mile-an-hour winds.
Yes. Nancy.
Yeah.
No, let's wait a little bit here. I thought it was personally, I thought it was very, very important to know this battle or discussions that were leading to the Constitution, to the Constitutional Conference. I think is very vital for today because people need to know that this is not happening overnight. This was not a sudden occurrence and everybody had a brainstorm or a brain fart and then all of a sudden we had a constitution. That this was a long process that took place over years, and that there were very many different opinions and different opinions and different philosophies involved in this whole battle. So it's not an overnight occurrence. And okay, sometimes I think people nowadays think things are just supposed to happen somehow, somewhere, without our involvement, without our input. And I'm so glad that Nancy's doing this, because she makes it clear that people were very much involved across the public in this debate over the Constitution. And of course, the Federalist Papers played a huge role in that. So that was one thought I had. Okay. And then another thought I had was this whole issue about property qualification, which is not showing up in the Constitution. Property qualification, the idea that you have to own property in order to be able to vote, okay, which comes up in my studies of history, comes up over and over again whenever you have colonies or you have areas in the world where the British want to have control over the area. They always come up with this idea that, oh, if you don't have land, you don't have a right to vote. You're nobody, right? And so I'm so glad to see that this was not even, maybe it was discussed, but it didn't find its way into the Constitution. So I'm very happy about that.
I would just give a little plug for Nancy Spannaus's book, Hamilton versus Wall Street, the core principles of the American system of political economy. It's an excellent read, recently published by her, very thoughtful and well written. And I would just encourage people to get the book.
Thank you, Monty. Absolutely. Okay. That is a must read.
Magdalena, can I add to your thought?
Absolutely.
Yeah, it's Arlen here. And what you bring up about the right to vote based on, the connection to property ownership. In her presentation, she did speak as well to that there was a loosening of that from the earlier times in the colony, where it was actually described by what volume of land you had to own in order to have a vote. So of course, then you would have the aristocracy, the wealthy class, who could then maintain control of those lands and the region, and have everyone having to go by whatever they voted, whatever their authority was. And so, it sets up exactly that concern that, what is the origin of a man having a right? Is it that he owns a certain number of acres or a certain number of slaves or has a certain income? Or is it an inherent to the status of being one made by the Creator and living, breathing here, that one has the same right as another? And that's a pretty big foundational point about what I think the origin of America, what this is written for, and that can't be undervalued. That's what I got out of her presentation so far. So I really appreciated that. It was really good.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think Nancy is back.
I'm back.
Yay.
We don't know.
Windstorms, eh?
Yes.
So while you were gone, I was just discussing, we were discussing the issue of property qualification, and I made the point that many times the British always used the issue of land ownership as a means to control what laws were put through and who was supposed to who was able to vote and who not, and so forth and
Right,
so on.
right.
And I also discussed with the audience that I'm so glad that you're going step by step through this whole battle of how the Constitution came about, because there seems to be such a disconnect nowadays of people thinking that these things just happen by itself. Okay, it's like waking up one morning. It's like the Rip Van Winkle, right? Waking up one morning and everything is done for us.
Yeah, right.
And that's clearly not reality, right? So I'm so glad that you're doing this step by step, going through it.
Yeah, well, it really is people don't want to do the work of citizenship. I mean, I really think that's one major problem that we have in this modern world, because it does take work, and the best of our statesmen would probably say we're insane because they had such a workaholic personality, so forth. It's just crazy. And one thing I do want to tell you, which is a question, I in discussing the Constitution and its attitude towards slavery, I think I did this in previous classes here, talk about the Frederick Douglass idea, but Frederick Douglass's ideas on that. But I want everybody here to realize that I just posted today, I don't know how many people may be on my blog, an interview I did with Frederick Douglass, i.e. a living, reenactor of Frederick Douglass, for 35 minutes. It's on Abraham Lincoln, but we'll do one on the Constitution later on, I think. But it's really, this guy he calls himself an understudy of Frederick Douglass. So he's memorized speeches. He recites. I didn't give him enough time to recite the whole speech that he was going to do at the end, but he thought on his feet and cut it in his head. Ended up with it. But I really want to recommend it to you because it, as well as the blog in general, and my constant attempt to sell books.
So Ginger was so kind, and she put a link to that in the chat. Okay, Nancy, you're for some reason your camera is not showing you face on.
Oh,
okay.
Oh my goodness! Oh,
Yeah,
look, this went on.
Here we are.
I have two machines.
Now we see.
I have a special camera on the top, but it usually doesn't work on Zoom. It usually only works on Google Meet.
So now we can see you again. Before
now you
could
can
just
see
your,
again. Yes.
Your lovely hairline.
Yeah. Okay.
Did you want to continue with your?
Well, I was almost finished. I was talking about, recommending to you the written farewell address that Washington did.
Yeah.
Because often you just hear it discussed from the standpoint of factionalization, right? Which was obviously a major concern of his. National unity was something that he was absolutely obsessed with trying to maintain, as was Hamilton, really. But it isn't just that. He is also talking about maintaining positive commercial ties with other nations, but not getting involved in their politics, promoting, quote, institutions for the general diffusion of knowledge. So you have, unquote, so you have a learned citizenry, and maintaining virtue as, quote, a necessary spring of popular government, unquote. So he's very, there's no, the founding fathers' concept of what a Republican government would be is not value free, right? I mean, it's actually a very complicated question. How do you get a population to see that their welfare is intimately connected positively with the welfare of the nation, right? You've got it's that their identity, I mean, it's easier in war, right? To say, well, you know, if I won't exist if I don't get, if I don't contribute to the government and it doesn't exist to protect me. But it's to have that standard of the general welfare, which isn't necessarily what your population feels at the moment. So the solution that I think that the founding fathers were constantly thinking of was education, right? It was, you know, there is and I think that's a lot of what is our solution today, even when it looks pretty difficult to get, in my view, to actually get that. So I mean, that's I was going to say that, and then basically, when you just remind everyone that you're looking at the United States in the context of the world that existed then, right? And compared to what was going on in England, compared to what was going on in France and Russia and the German states, Italy, you know, we had a notorious lack of respect for nobility and people with higher class. Our general citizens were better read than most populations of Europe. And in no country in Europe could small landowners or mechanics have the level of influence on the government that they could have here. Did we have a class structure? Of course we had a class structure, right? I mean, it existed. It was traditional and so forth. But it was nothing like what the general population experienced in Europe. I remember feeling this in particular when Ed and I went on a trip to Germany and went to the Residenz in Munich. I don't know if any of you have ever been there, but it was one of the palaces of the nobility in the center of Munich. It wasn't like France. I don't know if it wasn't out in the open spaces commanding a whole huge area. It was right down in the town. But it was, I mean, any rich house here pales in comparison to what this thing was. You know, the huge marble rooms with all the statues of heads of all the heads of, the Roman emperors that people claimed they were descended from, and, you know, the gold this and the whatever. It's nothing like it now. I mean, and then as my conclusion was, granted the realities of life in America were far from living up to the revolutionary ideals. I mean, that what Rush said is true, although Rush very much supported the Constitution. Even though he was the president of the Pennsylvania Abolition Society after Franklin, so he was very active in the anti-slavery movement, but he still supported the Constitution. The revolution is still in process, but in the world of landed oligarchs, empires, and oppression of the vast majority of the human race, the U.S. government did turn the world upside down and give it hope for a better future. So, I don't find this stuff easy, right? Because there are so many things where you think, well, I wouldn't have liked that, but we're in a different world, right? And the principles that people were trying to achieve are very clear. So is there anything else you would like to
Thank you
discuss?
so much, Nancy. That was wonderful. So I had put a message in the chat board before. If you have questions for Nancy, please put your name in there. I'll call on you in the order of appearance, or you can also raise your hand, the digital hand, and I will call on you. So Nancy, do you have a time limit, or what's the?
No, I mean, I get a little tired
Yes.
earlier than I used to get tired.
Yeah. Understandably. So
I
yeah.
go, past another, say, 15 minutes or so. But
Okay.
whatever you want.
Okay. So Kelly said that he has a question. Kelly, do you want to, unmute yourself and pose
Can you
it?
hear me?
Yeah.
Yes.
Okay. Yeah, the whole history. It's amazing how these people they started it. This new government and everything. I'm thinking like way back in the 1800s. A lot of people like went to churches and they had a good spiritual upbringing as well as educational, like you said. Everybody can read and write back then, where even today, where I'm not so sure. One of the things you said was, the abolition of religion in the government, which is, I think it's a good thing, but at the same time, like especially maybe today, churches aren't a big thing in today's society, and the churches would teach us like morals or principles on how to get along with other people in our communities, in our world, basically. I like to call them like universal kind of rules, like, do unto others as you do to yourself. Vices like having greed, like people get greedy even though you have all these rules. If you still have a greedy in your virtue, it helps to corrupt your government. And I think that might be some of the problems we're having today.
Well, you will see if you read George Washington's farewell address that, and actually many of the other founding fathers, not all, they were split on the question of the value of religion. But none of them was anti-religious, except maybe Thomas Paine. And Washington in particular saw that, as you do, as a source of virtue. But they didn't confuse that with this having the state mandate what religion you were going to have and who are you going to pay money to every month to support, right?
Yeah.
The disestablishment of the churches was basically eliminating, preventing you from saying this kind of church is illegal, right? You can't, like in Virginia, for example, prior to that, nobody but Anglicans could have a church, right? That you would have to have a meeting house, or you would have to have meet in your living room or something like that. You also had to pay I don't think it was a tithe, but it was a contribution to the state. I mean, to the church. And in Virginia, even there were other denominations. There was a Lutheran church, for example. But if you wanted to be a Lutheran minister, you had to go and get ordained in the Anglican church in England and then come back and be a Lutheran minister. So it was, and in Massachusetts, you were, you couldn't be a Baptist. You couldn't be a Quaker, right? Because they were convinced they were right and so forth and so on. So those were changed to make it possible for anyone to go to the church they wanted. That's a bit different from saying you can't say anything about religion in school, right? Or something. It just means that that the state is not putting power, the power of taxation, the power of legally banning. It's against a particular religion. New York was the best, actually, in terms of. Hamilton was involved in the draft. I see one question. I'm answering it because it's relevant right now. Hamilton, the farewell address came in the following way. Just to not skip over a step. George Washington didn't want to run for a second term. He not only didn't want to run for a third term, he didn't want to run for a second term. So he had James Madison write him a farewell address at that time. And then when he decided that he definitely wasn't going to run for a third term, he took up Madison's draft and sent it to Hamilton, maybe edited it himself, then sent it to Hamilton, to say, what do you think? Mm. And my understanding is that, and Hamilton radically edited it, if not replaced it. And Washington somewhat edited what Hamilton did. That's my understanding. Yes, Hamilton had a major role in that final address, but he wasn't the only one. So I don't know how much of Madison was in there, and Washington was always trying, as long as he could, to bridge gaps between his cabinet and associates so as not to split the Union apart.
Collaboration, yes.
Yeah.
I have Uwe have a question, and then Randy has a question. So Uwe, are you there?
Yes, I am. Can you hear me?
Yes, thank you.
Right. Thank you, Nancy, for your talk. I have a question, which is a sort of a practical question as how to deal with the situation where we have today many people in the world. So I'm from Germany, of course, and here in Europe, when you speak of America, and of American values, people don't know anything about the essence of what America is in terms of founding fathers and a republic essences. So therefore, they seem to be. I mean, the British Empire, seems to have almost succeeded in the way that people are almost happy if America would be over. So therefore, there is this question of how to get people to want to listen to what America really is. I know that's a difficult question to put to you, who's looking at it from a perspective inside the US, which is of course completely, not completely, but maybe substantially different. But would you have an idea on how to deal this situation?
What can I say? I've got a couple things to say. There's one's an interesting background story that you might use for the problems that people might have. As you may know, the German language was very widespread in Pennsylvania when the Constitution was established. And also when the Declaration was written. And a bilingual German in Philadelphia translated the Declaration right away, and it was a decent translation. But later on, that sort of got put aside, and people said, well, we have a real German translated or something, but they translated it from the French and so forth. And it was terrible, the translations. And basically what my friend said, this is all my friend, that they didn't understand the concepts because the concepts were alien to the tradition which they had grown up with, in terms of what the authority was, in terms of the idea of natural law, which was much more infused in the English Republican tradition. I mean, so much of what, there was a lot of influence in the American Revolution from continental sources, but and even from Leibniz, right? I read, a friend of mine showed me just recently, Leibniz's condemnation of slavery, which I had never seen before. But there is that cultural problem. The other thing I would say is my son lives in Italy, has lived in Italy for 30 years. And he specializes in speaking for Americans in Italy. So he actually has a podcast called This is America, where he tries to explain American traditions to Italians. And maybe that's what you need in Germany. A historical view that says, this is what you have here, but this is how it evolved in America.
Right.
On land issues, this may be a major, question, because how land was treated and what your rights to land were, on voting issues, on speech issues. I believe that the German tradition on libel and freedom of speech is closer to the English than in America, but I don't know for sure because I haven't really studied. But Anyway, that's an idea. He gets out there and he can make it a lot of fun. But
Thank you.
Nancy, does he do it in Italian?
oh yes, he's
fluent in Italian. Wonderful.
he's totally fluent in Italian.
Yeah, after 30 years, I would hope so. So, Randy, you had a comment about previously, but then I think it was answered by Nancy. Do you agree, or did you want to still ask something?
Well, I would like to ask something about Nancy's presentation. She addressed Article 1, Section 9, the titles of nobility. And from our studies of history, and I think Anthony Chatkin has probably gone into it a little bit in some of his writings, that there's a missing 13th Amendment regarding the titles of nobility, and how an attorney or a lawyer who has passed the bar and earned the title of Esquire would actually have one of those titles. And as a bar member, British Accredited Registry, is that part of the history you've studied in regard to the Constitution, how the British government has continued to maintain its hooks into the government here?
I'm sorry, I actually don't know anything about the source of Esquire. I really have not heard that, and it's always seemed to me a little weird, but to have Esquire after your name. But I'd have to look into it, Randy. I'm not familiar. Sorry.
No, that's okay. It's a rabbit hole. Thank you.
Then we had Richard with a question. Richard, are you there?
Well, in some of the reading I've done, I've seen the claim that Thomas Jefferson and most of the founding fathers, toward the end of their life, were very disappointed in how the experiment turned out. Is there any validity to that, or what would you have to say to that?
There were tremendous worries on the part of there was a book written about that not too long ago. Maybe you read it too, about John Adams, Hamilton, Madison, Jefferson, and anyway, I think that the most optimistic ended up being Madison. Because everyone was extremely worried. Things were tenuous. Things were tenuous for up and down for a long period of time, and I don't think we really consolidated until Lincoln. In many respects, because of the tensions and the intentional warfare, which was constantly going on from the empire. Because there was, while you had these positive attempts to complete the revolution, you were up against a huge power that was operating within the country, and it was heavily a financial power. I've documented that on the slavery question, and I would recommend my book Defeating Slavery. You can get that on Amazon, but it's very clear there where. Every time you were running into interference financially in that way. So yes, I'd say they were all extremely worried. I don't think, but they were willing to fight. I mean, Hamilton was at the time of his assassination was fighting against the federal attempts of the Federalists to secede from New England, and he was fighting tooth and nail to prevent that from happening, saying, you're going to break my heart. This is the worst possible thing you can do. Don't do it. Don't do it. So, I mean, these are fighters, people who went through ups and downs of depressions and so forth and so on. But we're certainly not manic revelers in what they'd accomplished. They knew it was going to be a lot of work. If you read that letter from that farewell address, he made it clear it's going to be a lot of work, and it depends upon it depends on your population. It can't just be the leader.
Nancy, thank you. Can you bend your camera a little bit, or?
Oh, I'm sorry. I'm
Yes,
sorry.
You're getting cut off again.
Maybe I'm grouping.
We have Arlen and Cynthia who have raised their hand. I don't know which one of the two did raise their hand. Maybe they're doing it together. Who knows? Go for it.
Together. Yeah, we are listening together, and we often have commentary under mute together. But right now, I had a couple thoughts. One, to Randy's point about the Bar Association and the lawyers and attorneys. And I don't remember exactly who it was that educated me to this, but that in the earliest times of the colonies, that I don't know if it was Pennsylvania or which one, would not allow attorneys and lawyers in. Like, they wouldn't allow them to practice. And they were actually able to maintain for 50 or 60 years to have their colony ongoing without influence from somebody that, well, voices they didn't want to have heard in their colony. Do you know anything about that, Nancy?
No.
Okay.
No. We'll they certainly let them in for the conventions.
Yes. Well, by then, certainly, yes. And so then the other, and maybe I'm being overly simple in my thought here, but I believe you said near the beginning of your presentation, I don't know, you said it in as many words, but that the revolution is ongoing.
Yeah, I did say that. Okay,
so I just wanted to be clear that people think that this revolution was a time with an end date, and whether it was seeing it as 76 or 82 or 83 or whatever, or like now you're bringing up that coming to the time of Lincoln. But I think that the comment that you also made, that people, getting off their butts and doing something with this, that they're not getting off their butts and doing anything about this concept that the revolution is ongoing, thinking that, I can't remember which said about Rip Van Winkle, that was you, Magdalena, that people just think that, oh, everything is the way it is, and it has been forever, and it always will be.
Yeah, sure.
And somebody else will take care of it. And so your point is well taken, that to open your eyes, open your ears, do some research, go get involved in your community, in your world, because those men, those people of that time, they took great risk. This was not just a nice little time where we're all going to sit down and talk about making the world a better place and everyone's happy and everything else.
Right.
Both with arguing as well and petitioning from each side to try and settle the argument and the common interest. But certainly in those earliest times, you'd be lined up for the stockade and to be hung as for treason. And so it took some courage. And where is that courage today?
Yeah. Well, there was somebody joked during signing, I don't know which one, I think it was the Declaration. Somebody joked and said, I'll have an easier time. I weigh more than you, so I'll hang, I won't have much pain if they hang me. whereas you're such a little guy, whoever this other person was who was signing, you'll have more agony. Yeah. It was It was a joke, but it was not. Anyway, I can't imagine that anyone would have banned lawyers. But I'll they may have talked about it, but
Well, what was told to me was that because it was all people coming from the old world, primarily from Britain,
I
and
mean, there may be
just
some
like,
people that they banned, but maybe they wouldn't accredit people with the legal degree from Great Britain. I don't know. But
the point of titles too. I think that is an understanding that we.
Yeah.
I think
I'll look
nowadays
into that Esquire thing. That's an interesting. It's an interesting thing. So there's one.
Thank you.
One more, right? Was there one more?
Well, I'm done. That's good. Thank you.
Wonderful. No, I don't think there is any. I don't have any other questions.
Okay, great.
Okay.
Great.
I wanted to thank you so very much, Nancy, for doing this. It was inspiring because, as I said, it's so important to know that this battle took place and people were fighters then, and people should be fighters again today.
Yeah, right. But they should fight informed.
Yes, please.
And those of us who look, Ginger says she has 3 of my books.
Yes.
Let's go. Let's catch up with Ginger, okay?
And Kelly is going to hold up his book again. Or who had it? Somebody was holding it up earlier. Okay, when you were.
Which book?
When you were Alexander Hamilton.
I've got this. I've got this one.
Okay, the feeling
and
okay.
The other one, which is
Hamilton versus Wall Street.
Yeah. This is the other one.
That's what Kelly's holding up right now.
Yes. Okay. I can't see. I'm not on.
Monty is holding it up. Sorry, Monty. Okay.
Yeah.
Okay. Well,
so thanks so very
much.
Nice
to talk to you guys.
We'll hope we do this soon again. Okay. Take care.
Take care. All right.
Bye, everybody.
Have a nice day and week. Goodbye.
Bye.
Bye.